All right, hello. Thanks to those of you who are joining and listening in. I appreciate you taking the time. Welcome to our workshop on global conflict and cooperation. This workshop is a new series that I'm developing focused on defining, exploring, and discussing global conflict and cooperation from the point of view of international government and non-governmental. I'm going to focus on climate change and cooperation. So let's jump right in. Our learning objectives with this workshop are first to define climate change. Secondly is to explain the Paris Agreement. And then lastly, describe why countries need to cooperate to address climate change. So let's jump right in. What is climate change? Here we'll have a short video. But first, I'd like to read this definition, which is climate change is a change in global or regional climate patterns, in particular, a change apparent from the mid to late 20th century onwards and attributed largely to increased levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide produced by the use of fossil fuels. Let's go ahead and watch this short clip about what climate change is and why it matters. I'll make sure our sound's set. All right.
Each one of us has three life support systems. We've got our own body, we've got planet Earth, and we've got the infrastructure of our civilization. Let's have a think about that second one, about planet Earth. It runs on energy. Energy is flowing through the system, it fuels us, it fuels our transport. We really need energy. So let's have a think about where it comes from and where it goes to. Energy comes in from the sun, from just one direction, and it goes into the earth. It gets absorbed by the oceans, by the soil, it gets taken up by life, it moves around the earth system, and then eventually it's radiated away into space. Now, in general, in principle, those two things are balanced. The energy coming in is more or less equal to the energy coming out. So you can think of it like a bath. Imagine that the energy in earth is the water in the bath, and energy is pouring in from the tap. That's the energy coming from space. And the plug hole is open, and that is the energy that's flowing out to the universe. And as long as the tap and the plug hole, as long as those two flow rates are equal, then the amount of energy in the Earth system, the level of water in the bath, that stays the same. But the problem is that carbon dioxide in our atmosphere is slowing down the rate at which energy leaves. It's bunging up the plug hole, slowing the rate of flow out. And what that means is that the level of water in the bath or of energy on Earth is going up very, very slowly. That is what climate change is. That increase in energy is an increase in temperature. And so the problem is we've got this extra energy sloshing around the Earth system, and it's changing the patterns, it's changing how the engine of our planet works. And that is why climate change matters. Now, when we look at our three life support systems, we can see why this is a problem. The infrastructure life support system is damaging our planetary life support system, whereas we need them both to be healthy. They're both keeping us alive. So what we need to do is to redesign the infrastructure of our civilization so that all our life support systems can stay healthy.
So you heard from Dr. Helen Zersky giving this analogy about what climate change is and why it matters. And I thought it was a very apt analogy because most of the times when we think about things on a global scale, it can kind of be beyond us. So we need to think about it in analogies. And I really found this bathtub one interesting. It reminded me of rubber duckies and bath time. And I think it's a useful one because it's like, oh, that means that all this energy is coming in, but we don't have the power to shut off the sun, right? But we do have some control over anything that might be obstructing the drain of the tub. So that's what climate change is. I'd also like to point out there's a website from the national, or NASA, I should say, and it discusses what climate change is and how it's different from weather. So let me go ahead and play these two parts to that.
What is climate? How is it different from weather? You might know what weather is. Weather is the changes we see and feel outside from day to day. It might rain one day and be sunny the next. Sometimes it is cold. Sometimes it is hot. Weather also changes from place to place. People in one place might be wearing shorts and playing outside. At the same time, people far away might be shoveling snow. Climate is the usual weather of a place. Climate can be different for different seasons. A place might be mostly warm and dry in the summer. The same place may be cool and wet in the winter. Different places can have different climates. You might live where it snows all the time. And some people live where it is always warm enough to swim outside. There's also Earth's climate. Earth's climate is what you get when you combine all the climate. What is climate change? Climate change is a change in the usual weather found in a place. This could be a change in how much rain a place usually gets in a year. Or it could be a change in a place's usual temperature for a month or season. Climate change is also a change in Earth's climate. This could be a change in Earth's usual temperature. Or it could be a change in where rain and snow usually fall on Earth. Weather can change in just a few hours. Climate takes hundreds or even millions of years to change.
So there we get a verbal explanation of what climate change is. And I also like this example too, because I think times when we think of climate, we're thinking of the daily weather, the weekly weather, and there's going to be times where it's hot and where it's cold, depending on where you live. For most of us in California, we're used to temperate climate, so it's pretty mild for most of the year. Obviously, if you live in different parts of the state, like in the Imperial Valley or the Central Valley, it can get very hot. And so most people think, well, obviously the climate changes every day. That's why I watch the news and I watch the weather, because I want to know what's going to happen tomorrow. But if you think about climate not just as this daily event, but as this system or this patterns of climates around the world, you start to realize that there is some stability to the climate that is experienced around the world. And obviously that is changing with the change in carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere. So now that we know what climate change is, we can look to the Paris Agreement. You might have heard of this, and if you haven't, now you are. The Paris Agreement was a significant moment for the world and the countries of the world to come together to say we're going to work to address climate change in a concerted and concrete way. So let's go ahead and watch a short video that explains what the Paris Agreement is and how it works.
What is the Paris Agreement? The Paris Agreement is a legally binding international treaty on climate change to limit global warming to well below 2, preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. This requires economic and social transformation to face the climate challenges now and moving into the future based on the best available science. The Paris Agreement works on a 5-year cycle of increasingly ambitious climate action. By 2020, countries communicate their plans known as nationally determined contributions. Countries communicate actions they will take to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions in order to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. Countries also communicate actions they will take to build resilience to adapt to the impacts of rising temperatures. This may include information on adaptation and finance flows. The Paris Agreement also provides a framework for financial, technical, and capacity building support to those countries who need it. Starting in 2024, countries report transparently on actions taken. Collective progress under the Paris Agreement will be assessed through a global stocktake. This will lead to recommendations for countries to set more ambitious plans in the next round.
And so there you got an overview of how this works. And I wanted to highlight this other section of this page that talks about how countries are supporting one another, because I think part of the debate is how are different countries cooperating and how can they assist each other to help meet this larger cooperative goal of addressing their country's impact on the climate. So go ahead and play this next few parts.
The Paris Agreement provides a framework for financial, technical, and capacity building support to those countries who need it. Finance. The Paris Agreement reaffirms that developed countries should take the lead in providing financial assistance to countries that are less endowed and more vulnerable, while for the first time also encouraging voluntary contributions by other parties. Climate finance is needed for mitigation because large-scale investments are required to significantly reduce emissions. Climate finance is equally important for adaptation, as significant financial resources are needed to adapt to the adverse effects and reduce the impacts of a changing climate. Technology. The Paris Agreement speaks of the vision of fully realizing technology development and transfer for both improving resilience to climate change and reducing GHG emissions. It establishes a technology framework to provide overarching guidance to the well-functioning technology mechanism. The mechanism is accelerating technology development and transfer through its policy and implementation arms. Capacity building. Not all developing countries have sufficient capacities to deal with many of the challenges brought by climate change. As a result, the Paris Agreement places great emphasis on climate-related capacity building for developing countries and requests all developed countries to enhance support for capacity building actions in developing countries.
So here you get a sense that it's not just like this general idea of cooperating, but how can cooperation actually be operationalized? So in this case, it's through financing, through technology, and through capacity building. And it's a very specific ask that countries that are developed, which are largely Northern Hemisphere countries, the United States, Europe, and parts of Asia, that they utilize their economic power to assist other countries to be able to finance projects, changes in their policy, the adoption of technology, and their ability to just adapt over time. And so this is the general framework of the Paris Agreement. Now, with that in mind, what I'd like to highlight is the United States' ping pongs with the Paris Agreement. And we'll start with President Obama, who served in office from 2008 to 2016, and then President Trump, who served from 2016 to 2020, and then President Biden, who's serving from this year going forward. So we're going to watch a few clips about each president's engagement with the Paris Agreement or withdrawal from the agreement or re-entering of the agreement.
Good afternoon, everybody. Today is a historic day in the fight to protect our planet for future generations. 10 months ago in Paris, I said before the world that we needed a strong global agreement to reduce carbon pollution and to set the world on a low carbon course. The result was the Paris Agreement. Last month, the United States and China, the world's two largest economies and largest emitters, formally joined that agreement together. And today, the world has officially crossed the threshold for the Paris Agreement to take effect. Today, the world meets the moment. And if we follow through on the commitments that this Paris Agreement embodies, history may well judge it as a turning point for our planet. Of course, it took a long time to reach this day. One of the reasons I ran for this office was to make America a leader in this mission. And over the past 8 years, we've done just that. In 2009, we salvaged a chaotic climate summit in Copenhagen, establishing the principle that all nations have a role to play in combating climate change. And at home, we led by example, with historic investments in growing industries like wind and solar that created a steady stream of new jobs. We set the first ever nationwide standards to limit the amount of carbon pollution that power plants can dump into the air our children breathe. From the cars and trucks we drive to the homes and businesses in which we live and work, we've changed fundamentally the way we consume energy. Now keep in mind, the skeptics said these actions would kill jobs. And instead we saw, even as we were bringing down these carbon levels, the longest streak of job creation in American history. We drove economic output to new highs, and we drove our carbon pollution to its lowest levels in 2 decades. We continued to lead by example with our historic joint and put forward even more ambitious climate targets, and that achievement encouraged dozens of other countries to set more ambitious climate targets of their own. And that in turn paved the way for our success in Paris. The idea that no nation, not even one as powerful as ours, can solve this challenge alone. All of us have to solve it together. Now, the Paris Agreement alone will not solve the climate crisis. Even if we meet every target embodied in the agreement, we'll only get to part of where we need to go. But make no mistake, this agreement will help delay or avoid some of the worst consequences of climate change. It will help other nations ratchet down their dangerous carbon emissions over time and set bolder targets as technology advances all under a strong system of transparency that allows each nation to evaluate the progress of all other nations. And by sending a signal that this is going to be our future, a clean energy future, it opens up the floodgates for businesses and scientists and engineers to unleash high-tech, low-carbon investment and innovation at a scale that we've never seen before. So this gives us the best possible shot to save the one planet we've got. I know diplomacy can be easy and progress on the world stage can sometimes be slow. But together with steady, persistent effort, with strong, principled American leadership, with optimism and faith and hope, we're proving that it is possible. And I want to embarrass my senior advisor, Brian Deese, who's standing right over there, because he worked tirelessly to make this deal possible. He and John Kerry, Gina McCarthy at the EPA, everybody on their teams have done an extraordinary job to get us to this point. And America should be as proud of them as I am of them. And I also want to thank the people of every nation that has moved quickly to bring the Paris Agreement into force. I encourage folks who have not yet submitted their documentation to enter into this agreement to do so as soon as possible. And in the coming days, let's help finish additional agreements to limit aviation emissions, to phase down dangerous use of hydrofluorocarbons, all of which will help build a world that is safer and more prosperous and more secure and more free than the one that was left for us. That's our most important mission, to make sure our kids and our grandkids have at least as beautiful a planet and hopefully even more beautiful than the one that we had. And today, I'm a little more confident that we can get the job done.
So there you heard President Obama making the announcement once enough countries entered into the agreement to bring it into force. What he was speaking to there is that an agreement at this level doesn't have teeth per se until enough members of the global community join it. And then once they reach that point, then the agreement has teeth. Next, what I'd like to do is to share the announcement from former President Trump when he made the statement that the U.S. was going to exit the Paris Agreement.
In order to fulfill my solemn duty to protect America and its citizens, the United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord Thank you. Thank you. But begin negotiations to re-enter either the Paris Accord or in really entirely new transaction on terms that are fair to the United States, its businesses, its workers, its people, its taxpayers. So we're getting out, but we will start to negotiate, and we will see if we can make a deal that's fair. And if we can, that's great.
In addition to that statement that he made back in June of 2017, there's also a follow-up to that. So let me go ahead and share that link. And what was interesting was that even though that statement was made in June of 2017, there was actually a 3-year delay for the U.S. to exit that agreement. So I'll go ahead and play these few sentences here. And I'll go ahead and change the voice on this one.
After a 3-year delay, the U.S. has become the first nation in the world to formally withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement. President Trump announced the move in June 2017, but UN regulations meant that his decision only takes effect today, the day after the U.S. election. The U.S. could rejoin it in future, should a president choose to do so. The Paris deal was drafted in 2015 to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change. It aims to keep the global temperature rise this century well below 2°C above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase even further to 1.5 C. Why has this taken so long? The delay is down to the complex rules that were built into the Paris Agreement to cope with the possibility that a future U.S. president might decide to withdraw the country from the deal. Previous attempts to put together a global pact on climate change had foundered because of internal U.S. politics. The Clinton administration was unable to secure Senate backing for the Kyoto Protocol, agreed in 1997. So in the run-up to the Paris climate talks, President Obama's negotiators wanted to ensure that it would take time for the U.S. to get out if there was a change in leadership. Even though the agreement was signed in December 2015, the treaty only came into force on November 4, 2016, 30 days after at least 55 countries representing 55% of global emissions had ratified it. No country could give notice to leave the agreement until 3 years had passed from the date of ratification. Even then, a member state still had to serve a 12-month notice period on the UN.
And so the article goes on to answer these questions like, what will the withdrawal mean in practice? How is the U.S. pullout being viewed? Could the U.S. rejoin the agreement? And not everyone in the U.S. is upset that the agreement was left to begin with. And so it's a very detailed article kind of explaining from not an American media perspective. The BBC is the major news outlet in the United Kingdom, to give this sense of like what's going on. And it's always nice to read how other countries and their medias are perceiving and understanding our actions as a country. The last thing I'd like to point out is now President Biden bringing the United States back into the Paris Agreement. So this is why you see that there's a ping pong, right, with respect to climate cooperation. So let's go ahead and open up that. Actually, I'll just play this part here.
Hours after being inaugurated, President Joe Biden re-entered the United States in the Paris Agreement, as he had promised to do. The re-entry takes effect on February 19th. The Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015 by 196 parties that pledged to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, a result of 25 years of difficult negotiations. Although the U.S. originally signed on to the agreement, the Trump administration pulled out in 2017. How much progress have Paris Agreement members made in the meantime, and what could change now that the U.S. is rejoining? The parties were originally set to meet in Glasgow, Scotland in November 2020, to ratchet up their targets for emissions reductions, but because of COVID-19, the meeting was postponed for a year.
So this article goes on to describe, the particulars of these efforts, and basically gives you a sense that there's progress being made around the world. And now with the United States back in the agreement, there's a sense of energy or momentum that's going to be coming forward to addressing the goals of the Paris Agreement. And so with that said, what I'd like to do is just conclude with why is cooperation important on this matter? And it's basically important for two big reasons. The first one is that global challenges require global responses. And if you think about the world, it isn't just one or two or three countries, right? It's the entire world. So a global response means most, if not all countries are responding. The second reason why cooperation is important is that you have to be able to see that there's a sense of shared sacrifice. And so most people would say part of the reason why Trump left the Paris Agreement was that the United States, quote unquote, wasn't getting a fair shake with it. But others counter argued that, well, the United States is the largest, the richest country in the world. It is the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, which was just eclipsed by China a few years ago, but at the time it was, and that the United States has this special burden, this special responsibility of being more responsive to these changes because we've contributed to the problem disproportionately compared to other countries. And so when you think about why cooperation is important, is that you got to have some skin in the game, and at the same time you got to own the fact that if you're disproportionately contributing to a problem, that you then have to disproportionately respond to the problem. So in this case, it's demonstrating that Engagement is key, but proportional response based on proportional impact is key as well. So proportional response and proportional impact. So with that said, I'd like to just conclude with, how does this relate to political science? So in political science, among the many things we're interested in, obviously, is conflict, cooperation. And we're interested not just in the theory of why countries have challenges in cooperating, but what are the mechanics that underlie it? So hopefully with this workshop, you got a sense of what the Paris Agreement is, and you started to see the underlying mechanics. And in this case, we zoomed into the United States and saw this ping-ponging. In essence, we focused in on a country's domestic politics to realize that sometimes this domestic politics can shape how things are done at the international level. And interestingly enough, the way this agreement was written basically made it difficult for the United States and make it difficult for any country to exit itself out based on the changes of domestic leadership. And so that was a change to this type of agreement compared to the Kyoto Protocols back in the 90s, because it basically says once your leaders of your country at a given moment in time lock your country in, it's going to be very difficult for you to leave. And that obviously makes it so that progress can continue to be made on the principles of the agreement. So this relates to political science because we're really interested in how countries work or don't work, how they work internally, and how that might spill over to their international affairs and actions. So with that, we'll go ahead and stop the recording and have discussion. And I appreciate you taking the time to watch. So take care and have a good night.